Welcome back to Interpreting the Scares. That's right, we're back at it on our month-long journey through the nightmares with yet another film that I've never heard about. And once again, it's a film that I was infinitely impressed with, and I can't believe that I never even heard of it before, mixing together themes of found footage, the slasher subgenre of horror, and an incredibly unique gimmick that needs to be talked about. It's Behind the Mask, the Legend of Leslie Vernon. In a world where famous serial killers such as Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, Michael Myers, and Chucky actually exist, a reporter in a small town interviews Leslie Vernon, the next big slasher, who takes the reporter and her camera crew on an in-depth tour on what makes him tick and how he'll pick his next group of victims. How have I never heard about this movie before? I love a good meta horror film, and there's at least one other meta horror film that I will be looking at later on this month. But I had never heard about Behind the Mask before, and it's incredibly tongue-in-cheek as far as slasher films go. This isn't the first time that we've seen something like this, of course. Scream was also a tongue-in-cheek meta-horror film that centered on the slasher subgenre of horror. The only real difference here is that this is primarily found footage / mockumentary style. The perspective is on the killer instead of the victim, and of course, the major gimmick, it exists in a world where the biggest horror icons actually exist, which is awesome. But it's actually more than that. It also has cameos from horror legends from movies such as Poltergeist and A Nightmare on Elm Street. Robert Englund plays a vital role in the film, for instance. There's definitely a reason or two to check out this movie. The meta stuff is indeed strong, but the problem is, a lot of the tongue-in-cheek moments seem to be borrowed directly from Scream, especially in how the killer chooses his victims, and how there needs to be a virgin, a jock, a clique of friends. Instead of Jamie Kennedy explaining it all, we just have the killer doing essentially the same thing. And when you compare the two, obviously Scream's going to come out on top. You can't really beat the mind of Wes Craven. So if you start ignoring all the meta stuff, you have the found footage situation and the gimmick about a world where all the horror icons actually exist. But there's also a couple of problems in both of those areas. The found footage element, it's not bad, but it does switch back and forth between grainy, amateur-looking found footage camera stuff, which is what you expect, and crisp and clean horror movie shots that can't be shot by the film crew because the victims would see the camera crew, obviously. So if it wasn't the camera crew, then who was it? Another problem with the found footage situation is it's so incredibly focused on being tongue-in-cheek and meta that it kind of fails to answer why a young woman would risk her life to interview a serial killer in the first place. That's another reason why Scream's better. The foundation just makes more sense. What about the gimmick? The absolutely intriguing gimmick, where the horror icons exist in the real world. Unfortunately, it's just that. It's a gimmick. You know, it's used to explain why this slasher exists, and it makes those meta moments that much funnier because the other slashers obviously pick their victims in a similar way. But after it introduces the story with the gimmick, it's quickly thrown away to tell the rest of the story, which is it's just like a penny saver version of Scream from the perspective of the killer. Don't get me wrong, though. That doesn't mean that the movie's bad. It simply means that it's not as unique as it imagines itself to be. I enjoyed the movie okay overall, though. The performance of the actor who played the killer, Nathan Basil, he was probably the best part of the film. This guy was pretty good, clearly having a lot of fun just chewing up those lines and making it his own. His slasher character, though, wasn't that unique. It was a combination of a bunch of horror stereotypes, kind of like Ghostface, but even Ghostface stands out on his own. So at the end of the day, this is a movie that I think is worth the watch, primarily because its premise and some of the cameos involved. You know, it's nothing groundbreaking, though. Whenever you have a movie that focuses so much more on ideas than execution, you do run into avoidable issues. And hey, maybe they didn't care about that. So let's go ahead and break down my final score for a second. From a technical, unbiased perspective, there's not a lot to praise here. The found footage stuff was fine, but because it was so inconsistent with the rest of the film, I can't exactly give things like cinematography or editing glowing remarks. I will give full points to the premise being interesting, and some of the dialogue that followed was clever enough, but this is not a technical feat of a film. It's a gimmick film. This score is 64%. As for how I personally thought about the film, or my bias score, I enjoyed it okay, like I said, but once they got through the aspect of the film where it introduced the story and the gimmick, once they did that, it pretty much slowed down to a halt. It got less clever, and by circumstance, it also got less entertaining. I got less interested. Once again, it's not as clever of a film as it thinks that it is. It starts out that way, but it doesn't keep momentum. I am glad that I saw it, of course, but at the end of the day, I'd rather just watch Scream. So my bias score is 60%, which means when we average the two scores together, we wind up at a combined rating of 62%, 62 out of 100 possible stars, or a C on my letter grading system. I guess the trend of movies getting better and better throughout the month has already been broken. Ah well, I'm not gonna complain. I have tons and tons more horror films to discuss at the end of the day, and I cannot wait to get started. So guys, have you seen Behind the Mask, The Legend of Leslie Vernon? If so, I'd like to hear your thoughts about it in the comment section down below. As for YouTube, you guys know what to do. Hit that like, subscribe button, and bell to be notified when I come out with my next review. Till then, peace out!